Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael Lofton. Honored to have the man, the myth, the legend, Karl Keating on, founder of Catholic Answers, author of Catholicism and Fundamentalism, and many other books, including this one, which we're going to be talking about today, 1054 and All That. It's a lighthearted history of the Catholic Church, again, by Mr. Karl Keating. Welcome to the show, Karl. How are you?
Thank you, Michael. We're very glad to be with you. How are you doing?
Doing good. Such an honor to have you on. I mean, I'm a product in many ways of Catholic Answers Apologetics. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church, and I know Catholic Answers is a very, very helpful resource for me in transitioning from Presbyterianism to Catholicism. So I certainly have to thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. And the saying is, the more the merrier. The more we have coming in, the better.
Right. Yeah. And, I want to talk a little bit about that, your experience in starting Catholic Answers and some of your thoughts on Catholic Apologetics in addition to the book. So let's maybe start there. Right. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you started Catholic Answers.
Well, I originally was practicing law. I've been doing that for some years. And one Sunday, my wife and I came out of Mass. And there on the cars in the parking lot, under the windshield wipers, were anti-Catholic flyers. They were against the Eucharist and against the priesthood. And the flyers were published and distributed by a fundamentalist church just a mile away. So I took one off and I said, somebody needs to answer this. Nobody else seemed to be inclined to do so. So I decided I would do it. And I wrote up a tract of my own explaining the errors in that tract and what the Catholic Church really believes. I didn't want to put my name on it because I was a complete nobody. So I needed something that sounded more authoritative. So I said, well, here I am, a Catholic giving an answer. So I'll invent the name Catholic Answers as a group. Let people think that there are a lot of people behind this operation. And then I didn't want to put my home address on the flyer out of fear that while I was at my law office, some fundamentals would come up to my home and irritate my wife. So I took out a P.O. box and I printed off a small run of these flyers. And a few weeks later, I went to that fundamentalist church and put my flyer on its cars during one of its services. And then I remember distinctly standing across the street, leaning against a telephone pole and watching what happened when that Sunday service broke. And the first people out the door were the elders or the deacons or whatever they may be. And they saw my tract on their cars. So they were starting to pick them off one by one, but they weren't fast enough. And the people came out of the church and most of them got a copy of it. I said, okay, my good deed is done. That's it. And I forgot about it. But then a week later, I said, well, maybe somebody actually replied at the P.O. box. So I went there. It was stuffed with letters. And the weird thing is that a good number of them were from Catholics. How they saw my flyer, I have no idea. But anyway, they said, this is good stuff. Send us your catalog. And I wrote back saying, I'm sorry, but everything's out of print at the moment. And then I started writing more. So I wrote 6 tracts total. And that worked for a few months. And then people said more and more and more. So I wrote another 6. I had 12. Then I wrote another 12. I had 24. And finally, I just sat down and wrote another 24. I had 48 tracts.
Wow.
And that was Catholic Answers for quite a while as I was still practicing law. And then later on, in the late 80s, I did 2 things. I started a newsletter and got paid subscribers for that and began to say, well, maybe it'd be possible to make a modest living out of this. And the other thing was that I wrote my first book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, which just took off and became a bestseller. And at the time, in its early years, the only 2 authors that Ignatius Press had more success with were Cardinal Ratzinger and Mother Teresa. So I was feeling pretty happy about that. And so in the first part of 1988, I closed down my law practice and went full-time with a couple of friends into Catholic Answers.
Wow, what an incredible story. And so, I guess prior to Catholicism and fundamentalism, there wasn't a lot of content engaging Protestant fundamentalism. Is that accurate?
Not in recent decades. That was it. After the 1940s, say, apologetics went into a kind of rest period, to be polite. It wasn't much done. It wasn't actually in many quarters in good repute. It was something after Vatican II that people thought one maybe ought not to do. Just let people come to the faith by osmosis. Don't answer their objections. Don't invite them in more directly. Don't deal with their problems or their charges. The way, for example, that the Catholic Evidence Guild in London did in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s very effectively. But during these years, I've been taking a lot of cues from Frank Sheed and his wife, Maisie Ward, who in that earlier period headed the Catholic Evidence Guild. And their works, Frank's works, were seminal to me. They were my main formation in the art of apologetics. I learned a lot of the faith in other ways, but in how to do apologetics, Sheed was a big influence on me. But for some reason, 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, apologetics was something that just wasn't much done. And so what I was doing at that time was fairly unusual.
Yeah, it sounds like you really met a need with the response that you got there. And you mentioned there how to do apologetics. Is there any advice that you could give us for those of us who are aspiring to be apologists or already are apologists or just are regular laymen who want to share the faith? What are some good tips that you could offer us?
The best tip is one I got from Frank Sheed, which is never argue to win, argue
Okay.
to explain.
Okay.
Every time you try to win, you actually end up driving somebody from the faith because it becomes you versus them. And
Yeah.
nobody wants to lose an argument. Okay. You should argue. And by argument, I mean the calm, rational, reasonable discussion of differences. It's not where you end up picking up somebody by the lapel and lifting them from the ground and try to shake sense into them. That's not argument. That's a misdemeanor. It's not argument. What you want to do is leave thoughts in the mind that will percolate and that will make their own argument internal to the person. So you can disabuse him of misconceptions. You can help him to see wrong lines of argument, illogical lines of argument. But if your mindset is to argue to win, you won't win in the long run. I remember there was in those early years of my apologetics work, there was a fellow on the East Coast who also engaged in apologetics, but he very deliberately said, my purpose is to win every argument.
Okay.
And years later, after we had sparred, he and I ended up asking him, how many converts do you think that line of attack made? And he really couldn't say any. Okay.
Yeah.
Because he actually did, I think, on net, have no particular positive influence in drawing people to the faith. Our arguments, our beliefs are strong enough on their own. We don't need to get our personalities into the situation more than necessary.
That's very helpful, though difficult to do. Sometimes there is always that element of pride that we have, and so we want to win the argument. And so, yeah.
I mean, how many times I want to just look at somebody and say, "You're adult. You have no idea what you're talking about."
Yeah.
You want to do that, and maybe a couple of times I have, but you have to really restrain yourself.
Yeah.
And I think if you step back a minute, think about it. The weaker one's argument in any topic, religious, political, social, artistic, whatever, the weaker your argument, the more you're going to get steamed up and emotional in trying to convey it. The stronger your argument, all you need to do is lay it out. It will take care of itself.
That's very helpful advice. Now, well, I mean, what's your opinion today of the apologetic scene in Catholicism today? What's your impression?
On the one hand, I'm pleased with how wide it is. When I got into apologetics full time, that was 35 years ago.
Yeah.
And nobody else was doing it.
Right.
I could come across some fairly recently written books that would be considered apologetical. They were almost all written by priests.
Okay.
And they didn't have much circulation, so they didn't get out among Catholics, let alone non-Catholics. But nowadays, I haven't tried, but I'm quite sure I wouldn't be able to count up the number of people engaged in Catholic apologetics. And that's a very good thing. As late as the 1940s, despite the kind of work that Frank Shee did in the Catholic Evidence Guild, which is almost exclusively a lay operation, despite that, apologetics was considered a priestly activity. Let Father do it. Okay. And those are the years of what I would call the Bing Crosby Church. If you remember the movies that he was in, the Bells of St. Mary's and so on. Anytime there's a problem, Father Bing took care of it. And the lay folks didn't have to do anything.
Right.
And that was an attitude that was still prevalent when I was young. And now, though, apologetics is almost entirely a lay operation. And I think that's good, because the folks who are being apologized to, shall we say, are lay people, right? I've had public debates over the years with Protestant ministers and so on. I've even had a number of those published, the transcripts of them published as books. But most of the apologetics work we do would be with lay people, whether Catholic or non-Catholic. So I think it's a great thing that almost all the apologetics work is done by lay people nowadays. So I'm very grateful for that. And it's been a blessing to me and a confirmation, I think, of my own work in a way, that there's a kind of legitimizing of apologetics over the last few decades. So more people like yourself have gotten into it and are doing a lot of good work. And of course, and using methodologies that weren't available to me when I started out. I mentioned I began in the late 80s with a newsletter, which eventually became a magazine. And then in the early 90s with a radio program, Catholic Answers Live. But even back then, that was unusual. And of course, there was no internet at that time. And there weren't many people at all going around giving public lectures. I did a lot of public speaking in the early 90s through the early 2000s. I was on the road a lot. And that was, in many cases, the best way to reach people who never heard apologetics discussed. But now with
Karl, seems like we lost you there. You said, but now with, and that was the last thing we heard.
Web presence.
Karl, can you hear me? I think we have a little bit of a delay. But you broke off there, and so okay, I think it's coming back now. At least I'm seeing the video a little bit better now.
There are certain negatives to the modern technology. When you're a speaker in front of an audience of several thousand, you don't fade out and fade in.
Right.
Your signal doesn't disappear, and nobody can cut you off without coming up to the stage and doing violence to you.
Sure.
So certain pluses and minuses.
Yeah. Well, you cut out about a couple sentences ago. You were talking about how there really wasn't internet around at the time, but you were using newsletters to get information out there. By the way, speaking of the internet, early on, you got the domain Catholic.com, which is one of the most brilliant moves that I think that really helped Catholic Answers. Tell me a little bit about that. How did that happen?
It was very serendipitous, and only later did I appreciate it actually was providential. I was late to the internet. I had no particular reason to get on. Back in those days, there were some chat facilities and so on, but there wasn't much on the internet. And one day I was curious. I said, I suppose I should have a website, but I'm sure all the good names are taken. So like Catholic Apologetics for you or something would be the kind of thing I'd probably end up looking at.
Yeah.
And so I checked. I said, well, who owns Catholic.net? And who owns Catholic.org? And there was a utility that allowed me to track that down. I said, oh, that's interesting. And I knew that Catholic.com, of course, would be the first one taken. I mean, obviously, it's probably owned by the Vatican. So But I looked up who owns Catholic.com. Nobody. I couldn't believe this. Nobody owned it. So I said, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm buying it. So
Right.
I bought Catholic.com. And like I say, at the time it was purely serendipitous. But later I realized it had to be providential. Because why would the very best possible domain name still be open
Yeah.
late into the game? Okay, no one
Yeah.
had ever purchased it. It hadn't fallen out of
Wow.
subscription or something. No, it had just never been picked up.
That's just so hard to believe, especially for those who had the .org or .net. Why didn't they get the .com? Wow, that is pretty providential.
Yeah. Well, I think back in those times, org was considered something that would be a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
It would imply that.
Okay.
Net had a kind of social sense to it.
Mhm.
Com was considered purely commercial.
Okay.
So if you were an apostle of whatever sort, you would not want to appear as a business per se.
That makes sense.
That was the thinking. Now, nowadays, of course, the view has changed.
Sure.
But in those early first few years when these things were available, I think that was what happened. So I lucked out.
Wow. And we're going to get to the book here in just a second, but I got one more question for you along this line. Any advice that you have for up and coming apologists? You gave us a little bit there earlier about how we need to be charitable and not try to win the argument. What other advice do you have for apologists?
They need to be read broadly. They need to read broadly. It's a problem if you narrow yourself too much on some of the intricacies of the argumentation, some of the fine points. If you read broadly, not just in theology, but in church history and in philosophy, and in even related secular areas, you're more likely to do a good job as an apologist. If you're one who writes, you've got a Substack or something maybe, you need to be a good writer. And you cannot learn good writing by reading apologetics, because most apologetics books are not well written. Okay, you can learn the argument maybe, but you need to recast it in a way that will be accessible to those who will read. You need to set your personality aside to the extent you can. If your personality has defects, and we all have defects in personality, we all have eccentricities, and you don't want to have it where people will focus on your defects or your eccentricities rather than on what you have to say, whether it's orally or in print or what have you. So there's a kind of he must increase, I must decrease approach that needs to be taken. And you need to have the intellectual chops to do what you need to do, but you also need to have the, shall I say, literary or even theatrical skills to convey what you're trying to do. You have to ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish in doing apologetics? Again, you're not doing it, I hope, to win an argument. But what are you in apologetics for? What good are you trying to do, and for whom? And so you do have to tailor yourself to some degree. Now, I'm not saying dumb down what you're saying. And I've always been very careful not to dumb down my arguments, but I've been careful also to try to make them understandable to those who haven't done the kind of reading or don't like to do the kind of reading that I do.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Is there one area that you think we really need to work on right now in apologetics? Something that's really just kind of lacking that you've observed?
I would say getting strength in the early history of the church and the writings of the fathers and so on. So the kind of ressourcement approach to things. And I found this actually as sort of a consequence of my first book. When I wrote Catholicism and Fundamentalism, I had two audiences in mind. First, of course, was the Catholic reader. But I also wanted the Protestant reader to take up the book and to profit from it. And so for his benefit, I deliberately made arguments without any appeals to papal documents or to conciliar decrees, because Protestants don't accept their authority. So I limited myself to three things: Scripture, early church history, and common sense. And I found out over time that the early church history and the writings of the fathers, say in the first 500 years, were powerful tools, because you could say, I can show you that this Catholic belief or custom or moral teaching goes back century by century, all the way to the first. And here are what the earliest Christians believed about these things. Here are fellows such as Ignatius of Antioch, who actually studied under the apostles. And here a bit later were other writers who studied under those who studied under the apostles, and onward. And I found that to be probably the most convincing kind of thing, because when we look at Scripture, for example, the issue of should infants be baptized? Can infants be baptized? We have to admit as Catholics, the Scripture is a bit ambiguous about that. We do see St. Paul repeatedly saying he baptized whole households, which I take to mean mom, dad, kids, servants, whatever, okay, everybody. But someone who does not believe in paedobaptism could say, well, he didn't mention kids because kids simply weren't talked about when adults were talking with each other. Okay, so there's an argument. So Scripture on its own can't close off the counterpoint of view on that particular issue. But when we look at the writings of the earliest Christians, whenever they refer to baptism, they're often talking about infants being baptized. And the big squabble in the early years wasn't, can an infant be baptized, or how long should we wait to baptize an infant? Is it legitimate to wait as long as 8 days? Okay, that was a common problem. Well, if that's the question, whether a child should be baptized on day 1 after birth or day 8, in either case, you've got infant baptism. Okay, so I found that using early Catholic history, and all that early history was Catholic, by the way, as I mentioned repeatedly in my book, that was a powerful thing to bring people to a different look at the Catholic Church and even Scripture itself.
Very helpful. Yeah, that was a huge thing for me, is discovering the church fathers. That was certainly something that gave me momentum in transitioning to the Catholic Church, seeing that the communion that I was in was so discontinuous from some of the things I was reading in the early church. So it's a big thing. Yeah. So let's talk about the book here, 1054. What exactly inspired you to write this book? It's a lighthearted book. I mean, we've heard a little bit of the humor so far in the interview. It certainly comes out in the book as well. It's a lighthearted history of the Catholic Church. What inspired you to write this?
I'd say there were two inspirations, one remote and one more remote. The remote one actually was what I just mentioned about writing Catholicism and fundamentalism and finding the value, the apologetical value of Catholic history. Most Catholic apologetics in the older times didn't rely too much on that. And so I discovered that that was a powerful tool, and I wanted to make use of it. The second, the more remote impulse, was actually this book, 1066 and all that, which came out in 1931 in London. Two authors, W.C. Seller and R.J. Yateman. And it was a spoof history of England. And the author said, this is our understanding of what the average Englishman still remembers of what little English history he was taught. And it was a very funny book. It's been in print now for, 92 years. And you probably would have trouble finding someone in England who's not familiar with that book. So now in that one, the title 1066 and all that, the 1066, of course, refers to the year of the Norman invasion of England, which was a pivotal event. So when I was thinking of doing a book about Catholic history, I thought, well, the best way to get people into it would be to take a lighthearted approach. Because if they get through that and they see that history itself is enjoyable, they would go on to more substantive things. So I chose the title 1054 and all that to mimic the famous book. And in my case, the 1054, of course, refers to the year that the Eastern churches broke off from the Catholic Church.
Right.
And so that's a key point in Catholic history. And then that earlier book was filled with line drawings, rather cute ones. And I thought, well, mine should have line drawings also. So I secured the services of a professional caricaturist. And he could do the kind of drawing that once was very popular about caricatures of Hollywood personalities and celebrities and so on. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got, for example, on one page there where I'm talking about Saint Joan of Arc.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite page shows Joan of Arc and the actress Katharine Hepburn. Okay, and the story about Joan brings up why there's that image. And if you're looking for it, it's on page 75.
Yeah, I saw it just earlier. Yeah.
So, so in this one, I wanted you to approach Catholic history. There we go. And I wanted to approach it in a way that would be accessible. So what I like to say is that 1054 and all that is real history, but with an attitude.
Yeah.
And I have a different kind of humor than appeared in that earlier British book. I would say maybe it's a dry wit or a mordant wit mostly, although I have a few goofball comments too, I have to admit. For example, early on, when I mentioned St. Justin Martyr, who was the first Catholic apologist, I say, not everyone nowadays understands the meaning of the term Catholic apologist. Let me explain it to you. A Catholic apologist is someone who goes around the country apologizing for being a Catholic. And then there's a footnote. And the footnote says, this is a joke. If you didn't understand that at once, stop reading here. You won't understand the rest of this book.
Right.
Okay. All right. And then to bring up maybe a more contemporary subject, someone who passed away just a few months ago, in the a little segment about Pope St. Pius V, I mentioned that he was the Pope that put the Trent into practice.
Yeah.
And he was quite successful, but he wasn't successful in everything. One thing he tried to do was to depose Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth. So I said, tried to depose Elizabeth, footnote. The footnote says, the first one, not the nice one. So, it's all reference to Elizabeth II. So I do that kind of thing a lot in the book. Maybe I can share this segment on to get.
You're cutting out just a little bit again.
Would that work?
Yeah, I didn't catch that last part. You said you were going to share something. I didn't hear after that.
I wonder if I could share my segment on Joan of Arc to give a flavor for how the book works.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So first of all, I don't have chapters per se. I have 111 segments from a quarter of a page to a page and a half on each person, place, event, heresy, whatever the case may be. And so this is what I say about Joan of Arc, and I spell her Arc, A-R-K. I said, in 15th century France, a peasant girl named Joan claimed to receive visions of St. Michael the Archangel, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine. After a meeting with the claimant to the French throne, the future Charles II, but repeatedly was rebuffed until she wasn't. They had a chat, and he was impressed. Joan was said to be a collateral descendant of Noah, and thus is known as Joan of Arc, A-R-K. She became famous for leading a French army against the English and for wearing trousers. She was the first woman to do both simultaneously. The English took offense and burned her at the stake in 1431. Joan's fashion did not catch on until exactly 5 centuries later, when Katharine Hepburn caused a stir in 1930s Hollywood by wearing trousers. Hepburn, unlike Joan, never was canonized because she never led a French army.
I like the humor. I saw it also come out with Augustine in his Confessions. I don't know if you want to explain that joke real quick.
Well, this is a joke that goes through several segments of the book.
Yeah,
and I mentioned that Augustine wrote the book called The Confessions, which was a bestseller at the time. but many people who purchased it were disappointed because the confessions didn't consist of what they thought it would, given the
Yeah.
title. They thought it'd
Yeah.
be something a little scurrilous.
Yeah.
And so in several places in the book, I mentioned that barbarian invasions and so on, as part of their cause, it was, for example, the final vandal attack and destruction of the city of Hippo, where Augustine served as bishop and where he died in 430. The attack came 3 years later. And I say the barbarians were still apparently upset with the book not being what they thought it was.
Right. It also makes an appearance with the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. So
That's right. Yeah.
I like that it's kind of an ongoing thing. So
Yeah. Something of an ongoing joke there.
yeah. So you broke the book up into 4 periods of 500 years. How come you
Right.
decided to do that?
Well, because the history of the church, in large part, is the history of the West.
Mhm,
And commonly, historians divide the history of the West into those periods.
mhm,
So, in the table of contents, I call them the early years, 33 to 500, the Dark Ages, up to 1000, the Middle
mhm,
Ages to 1500, and then the modern era from
mhm.
1500 to our own time. So that gave me a little structure to the book. And then in each of those 4 segments, I tried to put about the same number of incidents or people to be mentioned. So about 25 or to 30 in each grouping.
Mhm, mhm. And
Yeah.
so it looks like oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. I think I cut you off. I didn't mean to. It was cutting out on me.
No, but I'll add, of course, I made no effort to be comprehensive in this book. It's a thin book. It's 140 pages. If you want even a fairly comprehensive introduction to the Catholic faith, it'd be 1,400 pages, not 140. And even then, you would go on from that to a whole shelf of books. So my purpose here is not to be complete. For example, Scripture tells us that there were 15 men
Mhm,
denominated apostles. I mentioned only 3, Peter, Paul, and John.
mhm,
Uh, so I'm not trying to cover everything, but I am trying to
mhm.
give representative information over the centuries. And some would be things that every reader would know, and some would be more obscure things that I think many readers would not know but would be interested in.
Yeah, and you take a lot of things that well people might be aware of, but just don't really know a whole lot about, and you kind of weave them all together. And so I thought it was very helpful. Is that kind of the goal that you are trying to accomplish with the book? Take some of
Yeah,
the
I want
things
to
that
have,
people know here and there.
yes. So people probably have heard Arianism. What is
Hmm.
Arianism?
Hmm.
And so that plays over a few centuries in church history. So I mentioned that and other early heresies. I mentioned figures who have broken off from the church, such as Luther, figures who have persecuted the church in early and later times, such as Napoleon.
Hmm.
Uh, so I try to uh, give some sample uh, ideas and movements and personalities in every era of church history so that people get a sense of the variety, uh, but also begin to see that these things are really interesting. They're worth going into on your own. You might say, oh, what about Napoleon and how his attack on Popes Pius VI and Pius VII? Okay, I want to learn more, and there are books about that. Or I want to learn more about Joan of Arc and what she did, or about Augustine, he wrote about and who he wrote against, and all these kinds of things. So uh, every segment of my book is short. The longest one is about 650 words.
Hmm.
The book as a whole can be read in a single evening if you choose. But it's
Sure.
one of those things that you can dip into, in and out of, and I think get a laugh too. I had um, an author friend who was reading the book and was going to be writing up a review of it at Amazon. And he said that he stopped about a quarter of the way through the book to write his review at Amazon because he feared that if he read the whole book at one sitting, he'd have been laughing so hard that he wouldn't have been able to sit down and write anything at the computer.
Yeah, I love the humor that is mixed in with it. I love a good laugh, so I appreciated it. What was your favorite part to write? What was the thing that maybe brought the most smiles to your face?
You know, I probably most like the Joan of Arc piece because I've read the book through at least 10 times, which you do
Yeah,
for proofreading and all this.
right.
But I have to confess that I go back, I still laugh at my own jokes, and I especially like the Joan of Arc one. Uh, I like the Augustine one because he mentioned he repeatedly comes back. This is his most known book, repeatedly referred to. Uh,
Mhm.
so there are a number of places where I'll go back now. It's been a few weeks since I've read the book, but if I were to go back and I'd say, that's actually pretty funny. But in addition to being funny, it actually does convey the proper story. Okay. So
Mm.
all the incidents, all the facts, all the representations of the beliefs and the heresies and the challenges and all that, everything's accurate.
Mhm.
But it's all ladled with a lighthearted touch so that it will be more accessible to the reader.
Yeah, and I certainly appreciate that. What's been the reaction so far to the book?
Well, everyone who's contacted me has really enjoyed it. And one of the reactions has been is that doesn't read like your other books read.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's true. My other books, I think, have a certain style that's distinctive to me, but and occasionally they have witticisms, but mostly
Mhm.
they're straightforward,
Mhm.
you know, commentary and whatever. And that's whether they're my religious books or books in other fields. So this one was something new for me, but it's the kind of humor I have, and I think it's one apparently that readers like. I haven't yet to have anybody say to me, I thought it was too goofball or wasn't goofball enough, or, why didn't you cover this topic or that topic? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to readers that
Yeah.
there's no attempt to cover everything.
Sure. Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
But I've had so many people say, this has really made history delightful to me. And I'd like to learn more about such and so, or just church history in general. I'd like to learn more.
Yeah. So do you have any plans on writing any other church history books?
Well, I mentioned that I mentioned only 3 of 15 apostles.
Right.
So I've got plenty of room for sequels to this book,
Right.
if it's well received. Yeah.
Maybe
I
it could be called 1053 and all that, and it's everything
well,
in between.
I think the next one might be 1517 and all that. And
Uh,
honestly, I'm also thinking of a secular version of
uh-huh.
American history, which would
Okay.
be 1776 and all that.
Right.
So, because I think there's much to be said there also. So yes, I'm going to do some more history.
Mhm.
Maybe some of it in a lighthearted mode, maybe some a little more serious. But it's an area that I've always been interested in, so I'm sure I'll do some.
Is it pretty easy for you to write these, or does it kinda take some time?
Most of my books I have not enjoyed writing because
Yeah.
writing can be a real bear. A
Yes.
few books I've gotten through pretty easily. For example, a few years ago, I did a pilgrimage route in Italy,
Mhm.
and in 2 years back, I came out with a book about that called Sun, Storm, and Solitude. That book went fairly easily.
Mhm.
But I have to say that 1054 and all that is probably the first book I wrote. I actually enjoyed writing every single day. I just had a kick doing it. And I had to restrain myself sometimes about what to say or how to say it. But it was enjoyable. So that's one reason I think I probably will do a sequel,
Yeah.
so long as this book is well received, because it was fun to do it. On the other hand, I'm also working on books that it's too easy to procrastinate about because they're simply take more concentration or more emotion out of one to do.
I like the idea of 1517 and all that. I look forward to that. And by the way, y'all go ahead and put some chat questions there in the chat. Make sure to put them to at Reason and Theology. There is a comment here. Thank you for the super chat. It's from the Faith of the Church. His name is Jose. He has a Spanish channel. He says, Catholic Answers helped me a lot in my conversion from Protestantism. Now I'm doing apologetics in the Spanish-speaking world. In a way, I'm a fruit of Catholic Answers. Thank you so much. Please pray for me." So you've profoundly impacted a lot of people.
Well, thank you.
I think there was another comment here while I'm waiting on y'all to send some more. Let me see if I can pull some of them up. I think there was one from Teresa. Oh, but wait, let me grab this one. I love Saint Joan of Arc, Saint Teresa, the little flower dressed up as Saint Joan for a photograph. Emily says,
Yes, I
yeah.
remember that.
I think there was another one here. Here we go. From Teresa H. No question, just a big thank you to Mr. Keating for helping me understand the truth of the Catholic Church and my conversion 9 years ago.
Well,
I imagine. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yes, Teresa, a belated welcome to the church.
I imagine you've had a lot of people come up to you and tell you about how Catholic Answers has profoundly impacted them. Did you ever have any idea that this would be the net result?
Oh, no. And you know, and I don't know, we can't know what the net result is of the work that we do. And it's nice to get a shot in the arm by somebody saying, "Thank you, you helped me by your book or your lecture or your email back and forth." And that's good, because if we didn't get some of that, we could become too discouraged and not do the work. But I think, and I tell this to other apologists, we will not know here below what our work really has done. And I've encountered many apologists who are a bit discouraged in their work because they're not hearing from a lot of people. I say, don't worry about it. You've got a lot of people out there you will never meet in this life that you will have profoundly influenced. You'll meet them later and you'll be friends up there. So just keep that in mind. God will give you enough of a shot in the arm to keep you going. He won't give you enough, I hope, that you'll take credit for it, because you're only a tool. You know, I mean, he's the one. You know, Bishop Street, for example, often, "What have you made?" He said, "None. I didn't make them. God made them," and that's true. We're only his tools at best. We're tools that don't work very well, so we need to hand there. But it is nice, nevertheless, I have to say, to hear from somebody like Teresa, who has profited some way from the kind of thing we do.
Here's another one from the Faith of the Church. What is the best book on Catholic dogmatics that you could recommend? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, we keep.
It's cutting out pretty badly. Can you maybe repeat that? I couldn't hear you. Can you hear me?
We're back.
Okay, yeah. Can you repeat the answer? What is the best book on Catholic dogmatics that you can recommend? We couldn't hear it. It cut out.
Oh, I didn't answer because I didn't see the question.
Oh, okay.
Actually, that's one of the problems of the internet connections not being connected.
Sure.
Honestly, I don't know which book I would recommend most on dogmatics. I do know what book I would recommend most on learning the elements of the faith and being able to convey them, and that would be Catholic Evidence Training Outlines by Frank Sheet and Maisie Ward. That was instrumental to me. There's not a thing that's ever been asked, I think, Catholic Apologists that isn't explained well in that book. And it has many footnotes and references that one can then go on to something else.
David asks, were you concerned that taking a lighter tone might turn into making light of history? How do you seek a balance?
I kept in mind that there will be a few people out there who simply don't have a sense of humor. But I decided not to let them decide what I could write. You know, Chesterton had a beautiful quote that I actually include in the book. It said, "It is a test of a good religion whether you can joke about it." And I think that a certain kind of joke, a lightheartedness, is very appropriate, because the ability to laugh about something means you're comfortable with it. You're comfortable with yourself. And I'm very comfortable with my faith. I'm not thinking that there's some chance that it could be erroneous, that I've signed up with the wrong institution. I don't have the least worry about that. And so when I wrote this book, it's good-natured humor. It's not a poke in your face humor, but it's one I think that will carry the reader to an appreciation that even humor is a part of the truth. And we find that falsehood, whether it's in religion or politics or social things, the people who are promoting falsehood are always dour people. They're always angry people. They've always got a frown. And that should tell us something. That should tell us that if you can't smile and be appreciative of your faith and the people who were before you in the faith, then there's something wrong. Something wrong with you, not with the faith.
That's helpful. This is from Kevin. He says, I'm a non-Catholic and I wonder if this book is inside baseball. Does it grapple with the serious matters with any gravitas, or is it perhaps too lighthearted for non-Catholics?
Well, I have to say, Kevin, that of course I don't try to go into length on any particular issue. So if you mean by gravitas, a complete discussion of, say, Arianism, well, no, it doesn't do that. It doesn't attempt to. But I think it's very accessible to the non-Catholic reader, and that's a reader that I had in mind when I composed the book. I have a kind of tongue-in-cheek approach in some ways. For example, early on I mentioned, I have a little reminder. It says, reminder, all the early Christians were Catholics. Okay, and that kind of thing, which, by the way, is true. But I do that kind of thing in a not in your face, a way to do it. So I think that a non-Catholic could appreciate this book. There might be a few of my asides that a non-Catholic might not catch. Some inside baseball here. Okay, but that doesn't make the book any less accessible. The way I arranged it is I have a lot of footnotes, and they were for two reasons. And sometimes I would just want to have a supplementary comment to something I say that's not exactly a follow-on, but other times I use a footnote for comedic effect, because you would want to say something and have a bit of a comedic pause of maybe 1 second before you give the punchline. And one way to do that is to force the eye to go down the page to the bottom and to look at the footnote. So I've done that kind of thing throughout the book. There are almost 60 footnotes in the short book, but they're all done with a purpose in mind. So I think, yeah, a non-Catholic would enjoy the book. Would not agree with everything I say, because I have my point of view about the church history. But I think no non-Catholic would be put off by the book, either the humorous parts or the non-humorous parts.
Aside from this excellent summary, do either of you have recommendations for a more detailed telling of church history? And anything that comes to mind?
Yes. Although what's not coming to mind now is the author's name.
I'm thinking of Warren Carroll.
Well, I was about to bring up Warren, whom I knew.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, Warren never finished his multi-volume set on church history, but the volumes that were published are excellent. Okay. And so actually, here's a roundabout way that in my quasi-memoir called Book for Life, I look at 25 books that were crucial in my development as an apologist. And a couple of them were these history books that now I'm not bringing to mind. So if one were to look in there in Book for Life, you would see the books that I recommend for a thorough study of history. Yeah. But Warren Carroll's, yes, his books I can highly recommend.
Yeah. So have you considered writing a follow-up to Catholicism and Fundamentalism, Catholicism and Evangelicalism? Seems the problem has shifted from anti-Catholicism to indifferentism.
Well, Yes, it is true. Nowadays, the problem is indifferentism rather than so much the fundamentalist challenge to the church as it was in the late 80s, early 90s. That's true. But I would not think, if I did do a follow-up, it would be Catholicism and indifferentism rather than Catholicism and evangelicalism, because the evangelicals aren't indifferent to the Christian faith. I think they're mistaken in certain ways, and they're not, of course, they don't have the same attitude of opposition to the Catholic Church that the fundamentalists still do. Fundamentalism is still a problem, but it's not the problem proportionately that it was 30 some years ago. So I think the questioner is correct. The problem nowadays is mainly indifferentism. So have I thought about a follow-up book? Yes, but I've got other books in the pipeline that I feel I need to get out of the way first.
Okay. And this is a comment from Harley. He says, please tell Carl that his book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, was very instrumental in my transition to the Catholic Church in 1998 when I was a Baptist in a Baptist Bible college trying to prove the Catholic Church wrong. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Harley. And I'm very pleased for you that you were unsuccessful.
Yeah, indeed. Seems like that happens a lot. A lot of people try to take up the endeavor of refuting Catholicism and in the process end up converting to Catholicism.
Exactly. And this is especially true when they start to go back to read the fathers of the church or other parts of early history.
Yeah.
Because all of that stuff is Catholic. And you know, most Protestants who are devout and knowledgeable about their faith learn about things from 1517 onward. Mm-hmm. And then they have impressions about what scripture and things up to the year 100 were all about. But they are often shocked to find out what the earliest Christians understood scripture to be about, and what they understood the early church to be. Mm-hmm. And when you get back there and say, I don't find any of my distinctive Protestant beliefs floating around in the year 200, that's a powerful disincentive to remain where you are.
Mm-hmm. Again, I want to remind everybody, go and get a copy of it, 1054 and all that. I put a link to it there in the show notes where you can go and get a copy. Carl, it's such an honor to have you on. Any parting words, any plugs that you want to put in and make the viewers aware of?
I will. Well, I'll plug for the book further. I'll say it's available in 4 formats: hardcover, softcover, ebook, and audiobook. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so whichever way you like to read or listen to a book, it's there. If you get the book and you read it, you know, I would ask people to leave a short review at Amazon. If you read the book and you don't like it, I'd ask them instead to go treat themselves at their favorite restaurant.
Right. and don't leave a review. Wonderful, Carl. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this. It was truly an honor to have you.
Michael, it's been a delight. Thank you for having me.
All right. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. Again, go and get a copy of 1054. Got a link to it there in the show notes. That's going to do it, y'all. We'll see